In the Russian Far East, there exists a region known as Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Now you will ask, what is a Jewish province doing here, all the way in Russian Far East? So the answer to this question goes back to 1924. The Soviet Union was facing a problem. Jews in the Soviet Union were mostly small business owners. But when the Soviets outlawed private ownership, suddenly all the Jews became impoverished. In the meantime, the Soviets had a policy of giving territories such as republics, provinces, divisions, and even districts to ethnic groups so that they had a sense of belonging to the state. Now, there was a problem when it came to the Jews. They didn't exactly have a homeland in the Soviet Union. But in South Ukraine, there were three Jewish majority districts, and there were two in Crimea as well. So most people were thinking that if there would be a Jewish region, it would be in southern Ukraine, probably, or in Crimea. But Moscow had other plans. You see, the area where Jewish Autonomous Oblast exists today is on the border with China and back then with Japan as well. So there were a lot of infiltration from the Chinese and Japanese sides, especially by the White Russians. So if you remember the Russian Civil War, you will remember there were two factions, the Reds and the Whites. And many Whites escaped to China and even found jobs in armies of warlords. So Stalin was quite worried about these infiltrations, so he decided that if he created a Jewish province and settled it with Jews, that could actually act as a sort of border protection outpost. And that's why the Soviets established Birobidzhan Jewish National Rayon, which is basically region, in 1928. Yiddish was made the official language and private ownership was allowed here. And they were hoping that this will attract more Jewish settlers. And despite all this, harsh climate conditions, diseases, and the soil not being able to grow food actually led to almost half of the settlers that had arrived in the years 1928 to 33 leaving. The region would later see an increase in the number of Jewish settlers in the 1930s, but the purges of 1936 to 1938 weakened its developing framework once again. Not only that, but the purges also affected the Jewish migrants who had come from areas outside the Soviet Union. Then, from years 1939 to 1940, the Soviet conquest of the Baltic states and in Eastern and Central Europe increased the USSR's overall Jewish population. There were even plans to transfer them to Birobidzhan, but then World War II broke out and it never happened. However, when the war ended, many Jews who had lost everything decided instead of going back to their destroyed homes, why not just go to Birobidzhan? In 1948, just 3 years after the World War had ended, Jews made up nearly 25% of the population, numbering between 46 and 50,000. And this was the highest percentage they ever reached. And after that, what happened was that the Leningrad affair occurred and Stalin decided more purges in 1948 to 49. And once again, the region was badly affected. Then, around the same time, when Israel became a thing and USA and the West started supporting it, and it was clear that Israel is going to be backed by them, USSR distanced itself from Israel and decided to promote GOA. But it didn't work. You see, first reason was that the Zionist movement for Palestine was way stronger in convincing the Jews to go there. They could convince the Jews that your ancestors came from Palestine, so you should go there. Meanwhile, how do you convince them to basically go to a remote place in the Russian Far East? And secondly, most Jews in the Soviet Union were native to Eastern Europe. They lived in cities and they saw no point in moving to an obscure place in the Russian Far East which they had no connection with. And they didn't even see the incentives being provided as worth it. So, this led to the decline of Jewish population. A census in 1959 showed that the Jewish population had declined to just 14,269 people, almost a decline of 50%. Then in 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev played his card. So, in case you don't know, during the Soviet times, because they had distanced themselves from Israel due to its pro Western policies and actions, the Soviets were really worried that if people would go to Israel and then leak Soviet state secrets. So, overall, you couldn't leave the Soviet Union easily, and these people who were refused the permission to leave were known as refuseniks. And a great deal of them were actually Jews who had wanted to go to Israel, to the point refusenik was almost synonymous with the Jew who wants to leave but cannot. When Gorbachev did his reforms, he allowed some 11,000 refusenik Jews to leave the country. And just 2 years later, the census showed that the Jewish population had declined to just 8,887. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. By that time, most Jews had already left. And 5 years later, Israel's national airline El Al began chartering flights to carry Jews to Israel as well. They carried 872 people, which was almost 20% of the Jewish population at the time. By 2005, the community numbered less than 2,000, 1,600 to be very exact. And today, the region is basically ethnic Russian majority. The only Jewish thing about it is its, you know, legacy in form of buildings like the synagogue and all that that were built in those times, as well as a very small Jewish community that still exists today and practices their rituals. Thank you for watching.